Detective Mike Steele stopped mid-radio call, his voice cutting through the Montana wilderness as blood pooled beneath his shattered ribs. The twins found him there, Grace and Faith Morrison, 12 years old, clutching the leash of a German shepherd who should have been nothing more than a failed police dog. It wasn't an accident, it was an execution. Sarah Morrison's scream echoed through the forest when the call came in, her coffee mug shattering against the kitchen floor. The veterinary clinic fell silent as word spread. 2 little girls and their rescue dog were all that stood between a dying cop and whoever had put 3 bullets in his chest. Ellen Morrison gripped her granddaughter's muddy shoes, remembering how her son had asked questions about the wrong people before he disappeared 2 years ago. The same questions that had gotten Mike Steele shot. "Call everyone," she whispered, her 72-year-old hands steadier than her voice. "Call them now." What had these children stumbled into? And why was Duke, the dog everyone said had failed at being a hero, acting like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The town of Millfield, Montana, had always been the kind of place where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone died, and church bells marked the passing of time more reliably than any clock. Population 3,200, nestled between rolling wheat fields and the distant peaks of the Rockies, it was a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Main Street still boasted a hardware store that had been family-owned for 4 generations, a diner where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger, and a single traffic light that most folks treated as more of a suggestion than a rule. The Morrison farmhouse sat on the outskirts of town, a white clapboard structure with a wraparound porch that had weathered 70 years of Montana winters. Ellen Morrison, at 72, still moved through her kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had raised 5 children and worked 40 years as a registered nurse at Millfield General. Her silver hair was always pulled into a neat bun, and her blue eyes, though dimmed by cataracts, missed nothing. She had buried her husband Thomas 3 years ago after a brutal fight with cancer, and since then, the silence in the old house had grown so thick she sometimes found herself talking to the photographs on the mantelpiece just to hear a human voice. Sarah Morrison, Ellen's daughter-in-law, was 39 and still beautiful in the way that hard work and worry couldn't quite erase. She had married Ellen's son David when she was 25, fresh out of nursing school herself, full of dreams about raising a family in the safety of small-town Montana. Those dreams had crumbled 2 years ago when David simply vanished one morning, leaving behind only a note saying he needed to figure things out. Sarah suspected there was more to the story. David had been asking strange questions about local law enforcement, making phone calls he wouldn't explain, but Sheriff Bradley had assured her that men sometimes just walked away when the pressure got too much. The twins, Grace and Faith, were 12-year-old mirrors of each other in appearance, but opposites in temperament. Grace had inherited her grandmother's analytical mind and spent her free time reading forensic science books from the library, dreaming of solving mysteries like the detectives on television. Faith was quieter, more intuitive, with an almost supernatural ability to sense when people or animals were in distress. Both girls had been homeschooled by Ellen since Sarah started working part-time at the veterinary clinic, the only job she could find that didn't require her to leave the girls alone for long stretches. Duke had arrived at the Morrison farm 18 months ago, a 7-year-old German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a pronounced limp in his left hind leg. The Montana State Police had retired him early, citing physical limitations that prevented certification completion, but Ellen suspected there was more to Duke's story. The dog carried himself with the bearing of a professional, responding to commands he'd never been taught in their household, sometimes alerting to dangers that weren't visible to human eyes. The late September afternoon sun hung low over Morrison Creek Trail, casting long shadows through the ponderosa pines as Grace and Faith made their way along the familiar path. The air carried the crisp promise of autumn, tinged with the scent of pine needles and the distant smoke from someone's early wood-burning stove. Duke trotted ahead of them, his limp barely noticeable as he navigated the rocky terrain with practiced ease, his ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds the girls couldn't hear. "Look how he's acting," Faith whispered, watching Duke's suddenly rigid posture. The German shepherd had stopped dead in his tracks, his nose lifted to catch a scent on the wind, his entire body trembling with an alertness that made the hair on Faith's arms stand up. She had learned to trust Duke's instincts over the past 18 months. He had warned them about a rattlesnake last summer, had refused to let them cross the creek during a flash flood, had even growled at a stranger in town who later turned out to be wanted for assault in the neighboring county. Grace pulled out her phone, checking the time. "We should head back soon. Grandma will worry if we're late for dinner." But even as she spoke, Duke was already moving off the main trail, pushing through the underbrush with purposeful determination. The twins exchanged glances. Duke never left the trail unless something was seriously wrong. They followed him through a grove of aspens, their golden leaves whispering overhead, until they emerged into a small clearing beside Morrison Creek. That's when they saw him. Detective Mike Steele lay crumpled against the base of a massive pine tree, his khaki uniform darkened with blood, his radio scattered in pieces beside him. His service weapon was nowhere to be seen. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the earthy scent of pine needles, creating an odor that would haunt the girls' dreams for months to come. Duke immediately shifted into a different mode entirely. Gone was the retired family pet, replaced by something professional and focused. He approached the unconscious man with careful steps, sniffing around the perimeter of the scene before positioning himself beside the detective's torso. Without any command from the girls, Duke began applying pressure to the abdominal wound with his front paws, his weight distributed in a way that seemed impossibly knowledgeable. "Oh my God," Grace breathed, her forensic science books suddenly feeling inadequate for the reality before her. "Faith, call 911. Right now." Her hands shook as she knelt beside the detective, trying to remember everything she'd read about trauma care. Mike's face was pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. A pool of blood had already soaked into the pine needles beneath him, and Grace could see the torn fabric of his uniform where bullets had found their mark. Faith fumbled with their shared flip phone, the only cell phone Sarah could afford for the girls to carry on their walks. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice sounded impossibly calm given the chaos of the moment. "We found a police officer," Faith managed, her voice higher than usual. "He's been shot. He's bleeding really bad. We're on Morrison Creek Trail about a mile past the old bridge." She looked at Grace, who was now trying to apply direct pressure to the wound while Duke continued his strange professional behavior. "An ambulance is being dispatched," the dispatcher replied. "Can you tell me about his breathing? Is he conscious?" Mike's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and glassy. "The shipment," he mumbled, so quietly that only Faith, who was leaning closest, could hear him. "Bradley knows about the shipment." Then his eyes closed again, and his breathing became even more labored. Grace looked at her watch, an old Timex that had belonged to their grandfather. "The ambulance will take at least 45 minutes to get here," she said, remembering how long it had taken when Mrs. Henderson had her heart attack last spring. "We have to keep him alive until then." Duke seemed to understand the urgency. He moved with precision around the injured detective, first checking for other wounds, then returning to maintain pressure on the abdominal bleeding. It was as if the dog was following some kind of protocol, a systematic approach that spoke of professional training far beyond what any family pet should possess. "Where did he learn to do that?" Faith whispered, watching Duke's methodical movements. The German shepherd's amber eyes were focused and alert, constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting danger to return at any moment. The sound of an approaching engine made all three of them look up. A sheriff's department SUV was bouncing down the trail, moving faster than was safe on the rough terrain. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the vehicle, his uniform immaculate despite the urgency of the situation, his weathered face a mask of professional concern. "Girls, step away from the scene," Bradley commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. "This is now a crime scene, and you shouldn't be here." But Duke didn't step away. Instead, the German shepherd's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound neither Grace nor Faith had ever heard him make before. The waiting room at Millfield General Hospital smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, its fluorescent lights casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Ellen Morrison sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching the clock on the wall tick past the 6-hour mark since Mike Steele had been wheeled into surgery. The twins flanked her on either side, Grace methodically shredding a tissue, while Faith stared at the surgical ward doors as if willing them to open with good news. Sarah paced the small space, her nursing background making the wait even more torturous because she understood exactly what was happening behind those doors. 6 hours, she murmured for the third time. Abdominal surgery shouldn't take this long unless... She didn't finish the sentence, but Ellen knew what she was thinking. Complications. Internal bleeding. The kind of damage that even skilled surgeons sometimes couldn't repair. Outside in the parking lot, Duke waited in Sarah's pickup truck, his amber eyes fixed on the hospital entrance. Hospital policy prohibited animals inside, but the German shepherd had refused to leave the parking lot entirely. Every few minutes, a low whine would escape his throat, as if he could sense the gravity of the situation through the brick walls and sterile corridors. Sheriff Bradley had been a constant presence throughout the evening, checking on Mike's condition with what appeared to be genuine concern for a fellow officer. He brought coffee for the family, spoke quietly with the surgical team, and assured everyone that the Montana State Police were already investigating the shooting. "Mike's been working on some sensitive cases," Bradley had explained to Ellen earlier. "Drug trafficking through the ranch lands. It's possible he got too close to something dangerous." But Ellen's nursing instincts told her something wasn't right about Bradley's explanations. She had worked with law enforcement for 40 years, had seen how real cops talked about wounded colleagues, and Bradley's concern felt performative, like an actor who had studied the role but couldn't quite capture the genuine emotion. When he suggested transferring Mike to the state medical facility in Billings for better specialized care, Ellen found herself speaking up. "Dr. Rodriguez is one of the finest trauma surgeons in the state," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in medicine. "Mike is safer here, where the surgical team knows his case intimately, than being moved during such a critical period." Bradley's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, but he'd backed down without argument. The surgical doors finally opened just after midnight, and Dr. Carmen Rodriguez emerged, still wearing her scrubs, fatigue etched in every line of her face. The Morrison family gathered around her, Sarah's nursing background allowing her to read the subtle signs of cautious optimism in the surgeon's expression. "He's stable," Dr. Rodriguez announced, and Ellen felt the collective exhale of relief from her family. "It was touch and go for a while. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the abdomen, 1 that grazed his ribs. We were able to repair the damage to his liver and small intestine, but he lost a significant amount of blood. The next 72 hours will be critical." "Can we see him?" Faith asked quietly, her young voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head gently. "He's unconscious, and will be for at least another day or 2. Only immediate family for now, and even then, very briefly." She looked at Sarah with professional understanding. "You'll know when he's ready for visitors." His body needs to focus all its energy on healing. As the family prepared to leave for the night, Bradley approached Ellen one more time. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know how grateful the department is for what your granddaughters did today. Their quick thinking saved Mike's life." His tone was warm, but Ellen caught something else underneath, a probing quality, as if he was fishing for information. "They're good girls," Ellen replied carefully. "They did what anyone would have done." "Did Mike say anything when they found him?" Bradley asked, his question casual but his eyes intensely focused on her response. Sometimes trauma victims mumble things, try to communicate even when they're unconscious. It could be important for the investigation. Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. Faith had mentioned that Mike had mumbled something about a shipment in Bradley's name, but something told Ellen to keep that information to herself. The girls were too focused on saving his life to pay attention to anything else. She lied smoothly, her decades of nursing having taught her when to protect patient confidentiality and when to protect her family. The drive home was quiet, each member of the Morrison family lost in their own thoughts. Sarah worried about the medical bills. Mike's insurance would cover his care, but what about the girls' trauma counseling they might need? Ellen found herself thinking about her late son David, remembering how he had started asking strange questions about local law enforcement before his disappearance. Grace stared out the window, replaying every detail of the crime scene, her analytical mind already trying to piece together what had happened. Faith simply held Duke's leash, drawing comfort from the solid presence of the German shepherd who had somehow known exactly what to do in a crisis. When they pulled into the farmhouse driveway, Duke immediately jumped out of the truck and began pacing the perimeter of the property, his nose to the ground, his behavior alert and protective. Ellen watched him through the kitchen window as she made chamomile tea for the girls, noting how the dog's training seemed to resurface in times of stress. Whatever Duke's real story was, whatever had led to his early retirement from the Montana State Police, it was becoming clear that there was much more to their rescue dog than anyone had realized. "Grandma," Grace said quietly, accepting her cup of tea with hands that still trembled slightly, "why did Sheriff Bradley keep asking what Detective Steele said? And why did Duke act so strange around him?" Ellen considered her answer carefully. At 12, Grace was old enough to understand that the world wasn't always as simple as good guys and bad guys, but she was still young enough to be protected from the darker possibilities that were beginning to form in Ellen's mind. "Sometimes, honey," Ellen said finally, "the people we're supposed to trust aren't always the people we should trust. And sometimes animals see things we miss." The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of Ellen's kitchen as she sat at the old oak table, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Sleep had been elusive the night before, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. At 72, Ellen Morrison had developed an instinct for trouble, honed by 4 decades of nursing where reading between the lines could mean the difference between life and death. Something about Sheriff Bradley's behavior at the hospital had set off every alarm bell in her experienced mind. She pulled out a yellow legal pad, the same kind she'd used for 40 years to track patient symptoms and medication schedules, and began writing down everything she remembered from the past 24 hours. Bradley's immediate arrival at the scene, his pointed questions about what Mike might have said, his insistence that Mike should be transferred to Billings, Duke's unprecedented aggressive reaction to the sheriff, Faith's whispered revelation about Mike mentioning the shipment and Bradley's name in the same breath. Ellen's pen paused over the paper as a memory surfaced, sharp and painful. David, her son, had been asking similar questions about Bradley in the weeks before his disappearance 2 years ago. She had dismissed his concerns at the time, chalking them up to stress from his struggling marriage and financial pressures. But now, with the clarity that only comes from connecting disparate pieces of a puzzle, Ellen realized David might have been investigating something dangerous, Rising from the table with the determination that had sustained her through decades of 12-hour nursing shifts, Ellen decided to do what she did best: gather information methodically and carefully. Her first stop was Miller's Diner on Main Street, where the coffee was strong and the conversation stronger. If there were secrets in Millfield, they would eventually surface in the vinyl booths of Miller's, shared over eggs and hash browns by people who had known each other for generations. The diner was already busy when Ellen arrived, the breakfast crowd of ranchers, retirees, and early shift workers creating the comfortable buzz of small-town morning conversation. Dolores Miller, the owner's daughter who had been running the place for the past 15 years, waved Ellen toward her usual booth by the window. "Heard about the excitement yesterday," Dolores said, pouring coffee without being asked. "Terrible thing finding that detective shot up like that. Your granddaughters must be traumatized." Ellen nodded, stirring cream into her coffee with deliberate slowness. "They're strong girls, but yes, it was quite a shock." She paused, then added casually, "Sheriff Bradley seemed to think it might be connected to Detective Steele's recent cases. Something about drug trafficking through the ranch lands." Dolores's expression darkened slightly. "Well, there's been talk," she said, lowering her voice and glancing around the diner. "Some of the ranchers have been complaining about strangers using their back roads at night, vehicles with out-of-state plates moving through when they think nobody's watching." "Have they reported it to the sheriff's department?" Ellen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Course they have," Dolores replied, refilling Ellen's cup. "But Bradley always seems to have an explanation. Says it's probably just hunters or tourists who don't know the area well. Tells them not to worry about it." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But my nephew Jake works dispatch, and he says there's been a pattern. Every time someone calls in suspicious activity, Bradley takes the call himself. Doesn't send deputies out to investigate." Ellen filed this information away and spent the next hour moving through the diner, chatting with old friends and neighbors. By the time she left, a disturbing picture was beginning to emerge. Multiple reports of suspicious nighttime activity over the past 2 years, all handled personally by Bradley with no follow-up. Young people in town developing sudden drug problems, then either overdosing or leaving town abruptly. And underlying it all, a growing sense among longtime residents that something fundamental had changed in Millfield, though no one could quite put their finger on what. Her next stop was St. Mary's Episcopal Church, where she had been attending services for over 50 years. Father Mackenzie was in his office preparing for the upcoming Sunday service, his silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. At 68, he had been the spiritual shepherd of Millfield for 3 decades, and Ellen knew he heard confessions and concerns that never made their way to law enforcement. "Ellen, I was just thinking about you," Father Mackenzie said, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the worn leather chairs facing his desk. "How are Grace and Faith dealing with yesterday's events?" "They're resilient," Ellen replied, then hesitated before adding, "Father, can I speak with you confidentially? Not confession exactly, but pastoral guidance?" Father Mackenzie nodded, his expression growing serious. "Of course. What's troubling you?" Ellen chose her words carefully. "I'm beginning to think my son David didn't just abandon his family 2 years ago. I think he might have been investigating something that got him killed." She saw the priest's sharp intake of breath and continued, "And I think Detective Steele was investigating the same thing when he was shot yesterday." Father Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of kept secrets. "Ellen, I can't share specific confessions, but I can tell you that you're not the first person to express concerns about irregularities in our community. There have been several families who've come to me about lost children, suspicious circumstances that didn't seem to warrant official attention. What kind of irregularities? Ellen pressed gently. Young people developing sudden addictions, then either dying of overdoses or disappearing entirely. Parents being told by authorities that their children are simply troubled, that sometimes kids just run away. But these weren't troubled kids, Ellen. They were good children from good families, and their parents' instincts were telling them something different than what they were being told officially. Ellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the old church walls. How many families? 7 over the past 3 years, Father Mackenzie replied quietly. 7 families who've lost children under circumstances that never quite added up. And in every case, Sheriff Bradley was the investigating officer who concluded there was no foul play. Meanwhile, back at the Morrison farmhouse, Duke was exhibiting behavior that had Grace and Faith deeply concerned. The German shepherd was pacing restlessly through the house, pausing at windows to stare out at the driveway, his ears constantly alert for sounds of approaching vehicles. He had refused his breakfast, something that had never happened before, and had spent most of the morning lying by the front door as if standing guard. "He's acting like he's expecting trouble," Faith observed, watching Duke's agitated movements with growing worry. "Like he thinks someone dangerous might come here." Grace, who had been researching German Shepherd behavior on their old desktop computer, looked up from the screen with a frown. According to this, when former police dogs show protective behavior patterns, it usually means they've identified a specific threat. Duke isn't just nervous, he's in full protection mode. As if to confirm Grace's assessment, Duke suddenly stood at attention, his body rigid as he stared out the front window. The twins followed his gaze and saw a familiar Sheriff's Department SUV turning into their driveway. Sheriff Bradley emerged from the vehicle, his uniform crisp and his expression friendly, but Duke's low growl suggested the dog was reading something entirely different in the man's approach. Bradley knocked on the front door with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. Grace opened the door while Faith maintained a firm grip on Duke's collar, the German shepherd's muscles coiled with tension. "Morning, girls," Bradley said with a practiced smile. "I hope you're both feeling better today, after yesterday's trauma. I was wondering if I could ask you a few more questions about what you saw and heard when you found Detective Steele." "Grandma's not here right now," Grace replied carefully, her instincts telling her not to invite Bradley inside. "Maybe you could come back when she's home?" Bradley's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, you're both 12 years old, certainly old enough to answer a few simple questions. I'm particularly interested in whether Detective Steele said anything to you before he lost consciousness. Even something that seemed like nonsense might be important to our investigation." Faith exchanged a glance with her sister, remembering Mike's mumbled words about the shipment and Bradley's name. Something in the sheriff's tone, combined with Duke's unprecedented aggressive behavior, made her decide to lie. "He didn't say anything," she said firmly. "He was unconscious the whole time until the ambulance came." Bradley studied both girls for a moment, his experienced interrogator's eye looking for signs of deception. Duke's continued growling seemed to agitate him, and he took a step back from the door. "That dog of yours seems awfully aggressive," he commented. "Might want to consider some professional training before he becomes a liability." "Duke's never been aggressive before," Grace said defensively. "He's the gentlest dog in the world." "Former police dogs can be unpredictable," Bradley replied, his tone carrying a subtle threat. "Sometimes their training kicks in at inappropriate times, and they can become dangerous to the very families they're supposed to protect." He handed Grace a business card. "Have your grandmother call me when she gets home. It's important that we get a complete statement from everyone who was at the scene." After Bradley left, the twins sat in the living room with Duke between them, both girls shaken by the encounter. The German shepherd had finally calmed down, but he remained alert, his amber eyes fixed on the windows as if maintaining a vigilant watch. "He was threatening us," Faith said quietly. "Not directly, but he was definitely threatening us." Grace nodded, her analytical mind working through the implications. "And Duke knew it. Whatever Duke's real story is, whatever happened during his time with the police, he recognizes Bradley as a threat." She looked at her sister seriously. "Faith, I think we need to tell Grandma everything." "About what Detective Steele said? About how Duke acted? About how scared I was when Bradley was asking those questions?" When Ellen returned home an hour later, her arms full of groceries and her mind heavy with the disturbing information she had gathered, she found her granddaughters waiting for her in the kitchen, their faces grave with the weight of secrets that had become too heavy for children to carry alone. Duke sat beside them, no longer the playful family pet, but clearly a professional guardian assessing threats and ready to act. "Grandma," Grace began, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness, "we need to tell you some things. About yesterday, about Sheriff Bradley, and about why Duke is acting like he's protecting us from something terrible." Ellen set down her groceries and took a seat at the table, her nurse's training automatically assessing the stress levels of her granddaughters, while her grandmother's heart prepared to hear truths that would change everything they thought they knew about their safe, small town. "Tell me everything," she said simply, reaching across the table to take both girls' hands in her own. "Every detail, no matter how small or frightening. It's time we figured out what's really happening in Millfield, and why your grandfather Duke seems to be the only one who recognizes the danger we're all in." The basement of St. Mary's Episcopal Church had been transformed for the monthly community potluck dinner, its concrete floors covered with cheerful checkered tablecloths, and the air filled with the comforting aromas of homemade casseroles and fresh-baked pies. Nearly half of Millfield's population had gathered for the event, from elderly widows carrying their famous Jell-O salads to young families with children who raced between the folding tables with the boundless energy of small-town youth. It was exactly the kind of gathering where Ellen Morrison knew she could make her stand, surrounded by neighbors who had known her for decades, in a place sacred to community values and truth. Ellen had spent 3 days carefully planning this moment, reaching out to specific families through discreet phone calls and quiet conversations after church services. She had identified the 7 families Father Mackenzie had mentioned, parents who had lost children under suspicious circumstances that Sheriff Bradley had deemed runaways or tragic accidents. Tonight they would all be here, along with the broader community that needed to hear what Ellen had discovered through her methodical investigation. Grace and Faith flanked their grandmother as she made her way through the social hall, both girls acutely aware of the gravity of what was about to unfold. Duke waited outside in Sarah's pickup truck, his presence no longer welcome at community gatherings after Sheriff Bradley had made pointed comments about dangerous animals to several residents over the past few days. The twins had noticed how some of their neighbors now looked at Duke with suspicion, how parents pulled their children away when the German Shepherd approached during their daily walks. Sheriff Bradley held court near the dessert table, regaling a group of newer residents with stories about his 30 years of law enforcement service. He cut an impressive figure in his dress uniform, his silver hair perfectly combed, his badge catching the fluorescent light as he gestured expansively about, keeping Millfield safe from the criminal elements that plague larger communities. Ellen observed him carefully, noting how he positioned himself to monitor conversations throughout the room, how his eyes tracked specific families with the practiced surveillance of a predator, keeping tabs on potential threats. At exactly 7:30, Ellen Morrison stood up from her table near the makeshift podium and tapped her water glass with a spoon. The gentle chiming sound cut through the dinner conversations, drawing attention with the authority of someone who had commanded respect in this community for 7 decades. Gradually, the social hall fell silent, all eyes turning toward the woman who had delivered half the babies in Millfield and held the hands of their parents as they died. "Friends," Ellen began, her voice carrying clearly through the basement space, "I need to share something with all of you tonight. Something that concerns the safety of our children and the integrity of our community." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. 3 days ago, my granddaughters found Detective Mike Steele bleeding to death in Morrison Creek Trail. He had been shot 3 times by someone who wanted to silence him permanently. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Ellen raised her hand for silence. Detective Steele wasn't shot by random drug dealers or outside criminals. He was shot because he was investigating a systematic pattern of corruption that has been destroying families in our community for the past 3 years. A pattern that involves someone we trusted to protect us. Sheriff Bradley had gone very still at his position near the dessert table, his genial expression hardening into something more calculating. Ellen could feel his eyes boring into her, but she pressed forward with the courage that had sustained her through 40 years of advocating for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. "I want the Hendersons to stand up," Ellen continued, her voice growing stronger. "Tell this community what really happened to your son, Tommy." Janet Henderson, a thin woman in her 50s whose grief had aged her beyond her years, rose shakily from her table. "Tommy didn't run away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came home scared one night, talking about seeing things he shouldn't have seen." The next morning, Sheriff Bradley came to our house and said Tommy was in trouble with the law, that he needed to leave town to avoid prosecution. That was 18 months ago. We haven't heard from him since. "Mrs. Reeves," Ellen called out, "tell us about your daughter Sandra." An elderly woman with trembling hands stood at the back of the room. Sandra found drugs in her locker at school, drugs she swore weren't hers. Sheriff Bradley said she could avoid juvenile detention if she provided information about other students using drugs. 3 weeks later, she died of an overdose. Bradley said she must have been using all along, that we just hadn't noticed the signs. One by one, Ellen called upon the families Father Mackenzie had identified. The Johnsons, whose son Mark had disappeared after allegedly stealing equipment from a local ranch. The Williamses, whose daughter Beth had supposedly run away to California, but whose letters home had stopped abruptly after 3 months. The Garcias, whose teenage son Luis had died in what Bradley ruled a suicide, despite the family's insistence that Luis had been happy and making plans for college. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. Young people who witnessed something they shouldn't have, or who asked too many questions, or who simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sheriff Bradley offering them deals to avoid prosecution, then either silencing them permanently or forcing them to disappear. Parents being told their children were troubled, that sometimes good kids go bad, that there was nothing law enforcement could do. My son David started asking questions about these disappearances 2 years ago, Ellen continued, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. He had noticed the same pattern I've described tonight. David didn't abandon his family. He was murdered for getting too close to the truth. Just like Detective Steele was shot for doing his job and investigating the systematic destruction of our children. The social hall had become completely silent except for the sound of crying from several of the bereaved families. Sheriff Bradley remained motionless, his hand resting casually near his service weapon, his eyes calculating the distance to the exits and counting potential witnesses. "You're talking about some very serious accusations, Ellen," Bradley said finally, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "Accusations based on grief and speculation rather than evidence. These families are hurting, and you're giving them false hope by suggesting their children were victims rather than willing participants in destructive behavior." Ellen had been waiting for this moment, and she was ready. "Then explain why Duke, a former police dog who was supposedly retired due to physical limitations, recognized you as a threat the moment he saw you. Explain why he displays trained protective behavior patterns that suggest he wasn't retired for injury, but because he discovered something that made him dangerous to certain people. A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to understand the implications. Many of them had noticed Duke's exceptional training, his almost supernatural ability to detect threats and provide assistance that went far beyond normal pet behavior. The German Shepherd's aggressive reaction to Bradley had been witnessed by several community members, and Ellen's explanation suddenly made that behavior understandable. "That dog is unstable," Bradley replied, but Ellen could hear the slight strain in his voice now. Former police dogs often develop behavioral problems that make them unsuitable for civilian life. Duke's aggression toward law enforcement is exactly the kind of liability I was warning your family about. Duke doesn't show aggression toward law enforcement, Grace Morrison spoke up, her 12-year-old voice carrying clearly through the silent basement. He only shows aggression toward you. Detective Steele mentioned your name right before he lost consciousness, Sheriff Bradley. He said something about the shipment and warned us that Bradley knows. The teenager's words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Ellen watched as understanding dawned on face after face around the room. Neighbors who had trusted Bradley for decades, who had voted for him in 4 consecutive elections, who had never questioned his version of events when their friends' children disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. Bradley's hand moved closer to his weapon, and Ellen realized with crystal clarity that they had pushed too far, too fast. The sheriff was cornered now, surrounded by witnesses who could destroy him, in a basement with limited exits and dozens of potential hostages. She saw him calculating his options, weighing the possibility of eliminating the immediate threats against the risk of leaving too many witnesses alive. Outside in the parking lot, Duke began barking frantically, his sharp warning calls echoing through the evening air. The German Shepherd had detected something that set off every alarm in his highly trained system: the scent of fear, the sound of voices raised in confrontation, the electromagnetic signatures of cell phones being activated as people began calling for help. Sarah Morrison, who had been parking the truck, heard Duke's distress and immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong inside the church. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, requesting state police backup while moving toward the basement entrance. Through the windows, she could see the tense standoff developing between her mother-in-law and Sheriff Bradley, could see the way his hand hovered near his gun while Ellen continued to speak with the calm authority of someone who had spent 40 years talking people through life and death crises. Inside the basement, Ellen Morrison stood her ground, 72 years old and unafraid, surrounded by a community that was finally ready to hear the truth about the monster who had been hiding behind a badge for far too long. She knew they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, that Bradley would either surrender to the inevitable or try to silence everyone who could testify against him. But she also knew that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost, and protecting her granddaughters, protecting all the children of Millfield, was a battle she would not walk away from. The next few minutes would determine whether truth and justice could triumph in a small Montana town, or whether a corrupt sheriff would add the Morrison family to his long list of victims who had asked the wrong questions and discovered the wrong answers. The tension in the church basement had reached a breaking point when Sheriff Bradley's hand finally moved to his service weapon. The metallic click of the holster snap opening echoed through the silent space like a gunshot, causing several people to gasp and instinctively move toward the exits. But Bradley was positioned strategically between the main stairway and the emergency exit, and Ellen realized with growing horror that he had planned for this possibility all along. "Nobody moves," Bradley commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had spent 30 years controlling situations through fear and intimidation. "Ellen, You've made some very serious accusations tonight, and I think we need to discuss them privately. The rest of you can go home and forget this conversation ever happened." But the community members who had gathered for what they thought would be a peaceful potluck dinner were not prepared to simply walk away. These were farmers and ranchers, shop owners and retirees who had built their lives on principles of honesty and standing up for what was right. Janet Henderson, still standing from her earlier testimony about her missing son, spoke up with trembling but determined voice. "We're not going anywhere, Tom Bradley," she said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. "Not until you tell us what really happened to our children." Bradley's eyes darted around the room, assessing threats and calculating odds. He was outnumbered 40-1, but he was also the only person in the basement with a weapon and 30 years of tactical training. Ellen could see him weighing his options: surrender and face life in prison for multiple murders, or eliminate the witnesses and try to control the narrative one final time. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with," Bradley said, his facade of community protector finally cracking to reveal the calculating predator underneath. "This town was dying before I took control. No jobs, no future, young people leaving as soon as they graduated. I created opportunities. I brought money into this community through carefully managed partnerships with suppliers who needed discreet transportation routes." Grace Morrison, still standing beside her grandmother, felt her blood run cold as she understood what Bradley was confessing to. "You were working with drug dealers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were supposed to protect us, and instead you were helping criminals." Bradley's laugh was bitter and without humor. "I was protecting this town from economic collapse. The money from those partnerships funded new equipment for the sheriff's department, repairs to community infrastructure, programs for the elderly. Your precious Millfield would have been a ghost town without my vision and leadership." Ellen stepped forward, placing herself between Bradley and her granddaughters, her 72-year-old frame seemingly fragile but her spirit unbreakable. "And the children who died? The families destroyed? What about them, Tom?" "Casualties of progress," Bradley replied coldly. "Sometimes young people see things they shouldn't see, ask questions they shouldn't ask. When they become liabilities, difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good of the community." The basement fell silent, except for the sound of muffled sobbing from several of the bereaved parents. Outside, Duke's barking had grown more frantic, and the sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance. Sarah's 911 call had brought state police back up, but they were still minutes away. Bradley heard the sirens too, and realized his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He pulled his service weapon completely free of its holster, the black metal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Ellen, you and your granddaughters are coming with me. We're going to walk out of here together, get in my vehicle, and drive somewhere we can discuss this situation more privately." But Ellen Morrison had not survived 7 decades of life, 40 years of nursing, and the recent death of her beloved husband, only to be intimidated by a corrupt sheriff who had destroyed so many families. She stood her ground, her back straight and her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Tom Bradley," she said firmly. "And neither are my granddaughters. If you want to shoot a 72-year-old woman and 2 12-year-old girls in front of 40 witnesses in the basement of a church, then that's what you'll have to do. But we're not making it easy for you to add us to your list of victims." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Bradley's weapon was trained on Ellen while community members pressed themselves against the walls, some praying audibly, others reaching for their cell phones to record what might be their final moments. Grace and Faith Morrison flanked their grandmother, their young faces pale but determined, drawing strength from the woman who had raised them to believe that some principles were worth dying for. Then, the basement door burst open, and Duke came charging down the stairs like a force of nature unleashed. The German Shepherd had somehow broken free from Sarah's truck. Whether through his own determination or Sarah's decision to release him, and his 7 years of police training combined with 18 months of protective bonding with the Morrison family created a focused missile of fur, muscle, and unwavering loyalty. Bradley spun toward the sound of Duke's approach, his weapon tracking the movement, but Ellen seized the moment of distraction to throw herself forward. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, echoing off the concrete walls like thunder, and Ellen felt a burning sensation across her left shoulder as the bullet grazed her before embedding itself in the wall behind her. Duke's attack was swift and professional, targeting Bradley's gun hand with the precision of a canine trained to disarm suspects without causing unnecessary injury. His powerful jaws clamped down on Bradley's wrist, forcing the sheriff to drop his weapon as they crashed to the floor together. The German Shepherd's weight and momentum carried both of them into a table laden with casseroles, sending dishes flying and covering them both in green bean casserole and mashed potatoes. But Bradley was not finished. Even with Duke's jaws locked on his wrist, he managed to reach for his backup weapon, a small pistol strapped to his ankle that most civilians would never have known existed. His fingers were just closing around the grip when Grace Morrison, driven by pure protective instinct, grabbed a heavy ceramic serving bowl from the nearest table and brought it down on Bradley's head with all the force her 12-year-old frame could muster. The blow was not enough to knock Bradley unconscious, but it was sufficient to disorient him long enough for several of the male community members to overcome their shock and join the fray. Frank Henderson, Janet's husband, tackled Bradley's legs, while Tom Reeves, an elderly rancher with surprising strength, pinned the sheriff's free arm to the floor. Duke maintained his grip on Bradley's gun hand, his training telling him to hold until given the release command that only someone with proper authority could provide. Ellen, blood seeping through her blouse from the graze wound but adrenaline keeping her upright, retrieved Bradley's service weapon from where it had fallen and held it with the familiarity of someone who had grown up on a ranch where firearms were tools rather than toys. "It's over, Tom," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "The state police are here and you're going to face justice for what you've done to our children." The sound of boots on the basement stairs announced the arrival of Montana State Police officers who had responded to Sarah's emergency call. They found a surreal scene, a church potluck dinner transformed into a battlefield, with a corrupt sheriff pinned to the floor by community members and a retired police dog, while a 72-year-old woman with a gunshot wound held his weapon and calmly explained the situation to the arriving officers. As Bradley was handcuffed and read his rights, Ellen finally allowed herself to sink into a folding chair, the adrenaline beginning to wear off and the pain from her wound asserting itself. Grace and Faith rushed to her side, their grandmother's blood on their hands, but relief flooding their young faces as they realized the immediate danger had passed. Duke, finally given the release command by one of the state police officers, reluctantly let go of Bradley's wrist and moved to Ellen's side, his amber eyes scanning her injury with professional assessment. The German Shepherd's tail wagged once, a brief acknowledgement that his pack was safe, before he settled into guard position beside the Morrison family, ready to defend them against any remaining threats. The nightmare that had gripped Millfield for 3 years was finally over, but the cost had been devastating. 7 families had lost children to Bradley's corruption, and the community would need time to heal from the betrayal of trust that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The revelation came 3 days after Sheriff Bradley's arrest, when FBI agents arrived in Millfield with boxes of evidence and a story that turned everything the Morrison family thought they knew about Duke completely upside down. Ellen sat in her kitchen, her left arm in a sling from the bullet graze, while Special Agent Rebecca Torres spread photographs across the worn oak table that had witnessed decades of family conversations. The images showed a younger Duke in full police regalia, his ears alert and his stance professional, working alongside a handler whose face had been carefully obscured in every photo. Duke wasn't retired because of physical limitations, Agent Torres explained, her voice carrying the weight of classified information finally being brought to light. He was retired because he had become a liability to a deep-cover operation that Sheriff Bradley was unknowingly compromising. She pointed to one of the photographs showing Duke alerting to a hidden compartment in a vehicle. Your dog was part of a joint federal task force investigating drug trafficking corridors through rural Montana. He was one of the most successful narcotics detection dogs in the program. Grace and Faith exchanged glances, their 12-year-old minds struggling to process the magnitude of what they were learning. The dog they had known as a gentle, limping family pet had actually been an elite federal agent with years of specialized training. Sarah, who had been caring for Ellen's wound, stopped mid-motion, her nursing background allowing her to understand the implications of what Agent Torres was revealing. The explosion that injured Duke 3 years ago wasn't an accident, Agent Torres continued, sliding another photograph across the table. This one showed the aftermath of what appeared to be a controlled detonation in a remote area of forest. Duke had discovered evidence that someone within the local law enforcement structure was providing protection to the trafficking operation. The explosion was meant to kill him, not just injure him. Ellen's weathered hand trembled slightly as she reached for one of the photographs. You're saying someone tried to murder Duke because he was getting too close to Sheriff Bradley's involvement with drug dealers? Not someone, Agent Torres replied grimly. Sheriff Bradley himself. The federal task force had been monitoring communications between Bradley and known trafficking organizations for months. When Duke's alerts began to focus on locations and vehicles connected to Bradley's operation, the sheriff realized the dog posed a direct threat to his carefully constructed criminal enterprise. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady rhythm marking time that suddenly felt precious and fragile. Duke lay at Ellen's feet, his amber eyes moving between the FBI agent and the photographs as if he understood the significance of what was being discussed. For 3 years, he had lived with the trauma of that explosion, the guilt of surviving when his mission remained incomplete, the constant awareness that the criminals he had been trained to detect were still operating freely in the community he now called home. Duke saved Detective Steele's life because he recognized federal protocols in Mike's behavior, Agent Torres explained, answering the question that had been puzzling the Morrison family since the day they found the wounded detective. Mike was Duke's new handler, assigned to complete the investigation that Duke had started 3 years ago. When Duke saw Mike wounded in the forest, all his training kicked in. He knew that protecting a federal agent was worth any personal risk. Grace leaned forward, her analytical mind working through the timeline. So when Duke acted aggressive toward Sheriff Bradley, he wasn't just protecting us. He was recognizing Bradley as the person who tried to kill him 3 years ago. Exactly, Agent Torres confirmed. Duke never forgot Bradley's scent, his voice, his mannerisms. When Bradley approached your family, Duke's training told him that a known threat was moving closer to his new pack. His protective behavior wasn't just instinct, it was professional assessment based on years of evidence that Bradley was dangerous. Faith, who had always been the more intuitive of the twins, spoke up quietly. Duke knew all along, didn't he? He knew what Sheriff Bradley had done, but he couldn't tell anyone because he's a dog. He had to wait until someone else figured it out. The FBI agent nodded, her expression softening as she looked at the young girl who had grasped the emotional core of Duke's situation. For 3 years, Duke carried the burden of knowing that the person responsible for destroying his career and nearly killing him was walking free, was actually in a position of authority and trust in the community. When your grandmother began investigating Bradley's corruption, Duke finally saw an opportunity to complete his mission. Ellen felt tears starting to form in her eyes as she understood the full scope of what Duke had endured. The dog she had thought was simply a failed police animal had actually been a highly decorated federal agent, forced into hiding and early retirement by a corrupt sheriff who had tried to murder him. For 3 years, Duke had lived with the knowledge that Bradley was destroying families, was killing children, was using his badge to protect criminals rather than citizens. "There's more," Agent Torres said gently, producing a final set of documents from her briefcase. "The federal investigation has uncovered evidence that Sheriff Bradley was responsible for at least 12 murders over the past 5 years, including your son David, Mrs. Morrison. David had stumbled onto communications between Bradley and the trafficking organization. Bradley killed him and staged it to look like an abandonment because David was getting too close to exposing the entire operation." The words hit Ellen like a physical blow, confirmation of what she had suspected but hoped wasn't true. David hadn't abandoned his family. He had died trying to protect his community, just as Detective Steele had nearly died continuing that same investigation. The grief she had carried for 2 years, the anger at her son for supposedly walking away from his responsibilities, transformed into a different kind of pain, the ache of loss mixed with pride in David's courage. Sarah reached across the table to take Ellen's uninjured hand, her own eyes bright with tears. For 2 years, she had believed her husband had simply decided family life was too difficult, had chosen to disappear rather than face his responsibilities. Learning that David had actually died fighting against the corruption that was destroying their community reframed her entire understanding of the man she had married and lost. Bradley confessed to everything once he realized the federal evidence against him was overwhelming, Agent Torres continued, her voice professional but gentle. "He's facing federal charges for racketeering, murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, and his criminal organization has been completely dismantled." Grace looked down at Duke, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire revelation, as if he had been waiting years for this moment when the truth would finally be acknowledged. "What happens to Duke now?" she asked, voicing the question that all 3 Morrison women were afraid to hear, answered. Agent Torres smiled for the first time since entering their home. "Duke has officially completed his mission. The federal government considers his service record exemplary, and he's earned full retirement with honors. But more importantly, the Federal Witness Protection Program has officially designated the Morrison family as Duke's permanent placement. He's home, and he's staying home." The relief that flooded through the kitchen was almost tangible. Duke's tail began wagging slowly, as if he understood that his long period of professional limbo was finally over. He was no longer a failed police dog living in exile. He was a decorated federal agent who had successfully completed the most important mission of his career, protecting the family he loved while bringing justice to the criminal who had nearly destroyed him. Ellen reached down to scratch behind Duke's ears, marveling at the intelligence and dedication that had sustained him through 3 years of trauma and uncertainty. "You never gave up, did you, boy?" she whispered. "You knew we needed protection, and you never stopped being our guardian angel." As if in response to her words, Duke rose from his position on the floor and gently placed his head in Ellen's lap, his amber eyes closing with what looked remarkably like contentment. For the first time in 3 years, the retired federal agent could truly rest, secure in the knowledge that his mission was complete and his family was safe. The truth about Duke's identity would remain classified, known only to the Morrison family and the federal agents involved in the case. To the rest of Millfield, he would continue to be simply the remarkable family dog who had helped expose Sheriff Bradley's corruption. But Ellen, Sarah, Grace, and Faith would always know that they had been protected by one of the most elite law enforcement officers in the country, a professional who had sacrificed his career and nearly his life to keep their community safe. The nightmare was finally over, but the healing was just beginning. Millfield would need time to recover from the betrayal of trust that had shattered their faith in local law enforcement, and the Morrison family would need time to process the truth about David's death and Duke's extraordinary sacrifice. But they would face that healing together, protected by love, strengthened by truth, and watched over by a German shepherd who had proven that heroes come in many forms. 6 months later, the Morrison farmhouse kitchen was filled with the rich aromas of Thanksgiving dinner and the warm sounds of a family that had found its way back to wholeness. Ellen stood at the stove, her left arm fully healed from the bullet graze, stirring gravy with the practiced ease of a woman who had been cooking holiday meals for 7 decades. At 72, she moved with renewed purpose, no longer the burden she had once believed herself to be, but the acknowledged matriarch of a family that had survived unimaginable trials and emerged stronger for the experience. The dining room table had been extended with card tables to accommodate the expanded family gathering. Sarah bustled between the kitchen and dining room, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the ovens and the joy of hosting the first truly celebratory meal the Morrison family had shared in years. Her relationship with Detective Mike Steele had blossomed during his recovery, built on the foundation of shared trauma and mutual respect. Mike had officially transferred to the Millfield area and was now serving as the interim sheriff while the community rebuilt trust in their law enforcement system. Grace and Faith, now 13 and having grown several inches over the past 6 months, worked together to set the table with Ellen's good china, the set that had been saved for special occasions but had rarely been used since Thomas Morrison's death 3 years earlier. The twins had matured considerably since their terrifying encounter with Sheriff Bradley, their innocence tempered by experience but their essential goodness strengthened by witnessing their grandmother's courage and their community's resilience. Duke lay in his favorite spot beneath the kitchen table, wearing a ridiculous pilgrim hat that Faith had insisted upon, his amber eyes tracking the movement of family members with the contentment of a dog who finally understood his place in the world. The limp in his left hind leg remained, a permanent reminder of the explosion that had nearly killed him 3 years earlier, but it no longer defined him. He was no longer a failed police dog or a federal agent in hiding. He was simply Duke Morrison, beloved family member and protector of the people who mattered most to him. The doorbell chimed just as Ellen was placing the golden turkey on the dining room table, and Grace ran to answer it with the enthusiasm of a teenager who had learned to embrace joy whenever it appeared. Mike Steele stood on the front porch, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a bouquet of autumn flowers, his face bearing the healthy color of a man who had recovered completely from his near-fatal injuries. Behind him stood Father Mackenzie, invited to offer the blessing, and Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, the surgeon who had saved Mike's life and had become an honorary member of the Morrison extended family. "Welcome, everyone," Ellen called out, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her a beloved figure in Millfield for decades. "Come in out of the cold. Dinner is ready, and we have so much to be thankful for this year." As the gathered family and friends took their seats around the extended table, Ellen looked around at the faces surrounding her and felt a profound sense of gratitude that went far beyond the traditional Thanksgiving sentiment. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely widow convinced that her useful years were behind her, living with granddaughters she feared she was burdening, and a daughter-in-law struggling to make ends meet in the aftermath of David's apparent abandonment. Now she was the center of a thriving, loving family that had been forged stronger by adversity and united by shared purpose. Mike had officially proposed to Sarah the previous week, presenting her with a simple diamond ring during a quiet dinner at Miller's Diner, where their relationship had first deepened during the difficult days of his recovery. The engagement had delighted Grace and Faith, who had already begun planning wedding details with the enthusiasm of girls who had learned that happiness was worth celebrating whenever it appeared. Ellen had watched the proposal through the diner window, her heart full with the knowledge that her daughter-in-law would finally have the partner she deserved. "Before we eat," Ellen said, rising from her chair at the head of the table, "I'd like to say a few words about gratitude and family." She looked around the table, her eyes lingering on each face before settling on Duke, who had emerged from beneath the table to sit beside her chair. 6 months ago, this family was broken. We were living with secrets, carrying grief we didn't understand, and facing threats we couldn't see. We were saved by courage. The courage of 2 young girls who refused to walk away from someone in need, the courage of a dog who never forgot his duty to protect and serve, and the courage of a community that was willing to face difficult truths about people they had trusted. Father Mackenzie nodded approvingly, recognizing the theological wisdom in Ellen's words. "Doctor." Rodriguez smiled, remembering the fierce determination of the Morrison women during those critical days when Mike's life hung in the balance. Mike reached across the table to take Sarah's hand, his fingers tracing the engagement ring that symbolized their commitment to building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "We learned that family isn't always who you're born to," Ellen continued, her voice growing stronger with emotion. "Sometimes family is who you choose to fight for, who you choose to protect, who you choose to stand beside when everything seems lost. This table holds 4 generations of Morrisons, plus the people who have chosen to become part of our story. We are bound together not just by blood, but by love, by loyalty, and by the shared understanding that some principles are worth any sacrifice." Grace and Faith exchanged glances, remembering the night in the church basement when they had stood beside their grandmother as she confronted Sheriff Bradley, drawing strength from her courage and adding their own young voices to the demand for justice. They had learned that heroism wasn't about age or size or official authority. It was about choosing to do what was right even when doing so required tremendous personal risk. "Most importantly," Ellen said, reaching down to place her hand on Duke's head, "we learned that heroes come in all shapes, all ages, and sometimes all species. Duke taught us that loyalty means never giving up on the people you love, that duty means continuing to serve even when no one acknowledges your service, and that courage means protecting your family even when the cost might be everything you have." Duke's tail thumped against the floor, his amber eyes bright with what could only be described as understanding. For 3 years, he had carried the burden of incomplete justice, the weight of knowing that the criminal who had tried to kill him was still free to harm others. Now, with Sheriff Bradley serving multiple life sentences in federal prison and the trafficking organization completely dismantled, Duke could finally rest in the knowledge that his mission was complete and his family was safe. "So today," Ellen concluded, raising her water glass in a toast, "we give thanks not just for food and shelter and health, though we are grateful for all of those blessings. We give thanks for the opportunity to serve something larger than ourselves, for the courage to face difficult truths, and for the love that sustains us through the darkest times. We give thanks for second chances, for new beginnings, and for the understanding that it's never too late to fight for what's right." The toast was echoed around the table, water glasses and coffee cups raised in tribute to the values that had sustained the Morrison family through their greatest trial. As they began to pass the serving dishes and fill their plates with Ellen's traditional recipes, the conversation turned to lighter topics: wedding plans, school activities, Mike's adjustment to small-town law enforcement, and Duke's ongoing role as an unofficial therapy dog for children in the community who had been traumatized by Sheriff Bradley's reign of terror. Later, as the sun set over the Montana landscape and the dinner dishes were cleared away, Ellen found herself sitting on the front porch with Duke beside her, both of them wrapped in warm blankets against the November chill. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. But Ellen felt only warmth as she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. "You know, Duke," she said quietly, scratching behind his ears in the way that always made his eyes close with contentment, "I spent most of my life thinking that getting old meant becoming useless, becoming a burden that younger people had to carry. But you taught me something important. Experience has value, wisdom has power, and sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable are actually the strongest of all." Duke shifted closer to Ellen's chair, his body warm against her legs, his presence a constant reminder that she was protected and loved. Around them, the sounds of family laughter drifted from the house, Sarah and Mike planning their future together, Grace and Faith giggling over some shared joke, the comfortable noise of people who had found their way home to each other. In the distance, the lights of Millfield twinkled in the gathering darkness, a community healing from betrayal and learning to trust again. The Morrison family had become a symbol of resilience for their neighbors, proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together against corruption and injustice. It was a legacy that Ellen was proud to leave her granddaughters, the understanding that family means fighting for each other, that love means never giving up hope, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who simply refuse to look away when someone needs help. As the stars began to appear in the clear Montana sky, Ellen Morrison knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by the family she had chosen and protected by the faithful companion who had taught them all what true loyalty really means. At 72, Ellen Morrison discovered that her most heroic chapter was yet to be written. While society whispers that our golden years mean stepping aside, Ellen proved that wisdom, courage, and a lifetime of experience are our greatest weapons against injustice. When corruption threatened her granddaughters and community, she didn't retreat into the safety of silence. She stood up, spoke truth, and became the leader her family desperately needed. Alongside Duke, a failed police dog who refused to give up his mission, Ellen showed us that being older doesn't mean being powerless. It means having the moral clarity to recognize what truly matters, and the courage earned through decades of life's battles to fight for it. Her story reminds us that every gray hair represents hard-won wisdom, every line on our faces tells of battles survived, and every year of experience makes us more formidable, not less. In a world that often discards the elderly, Ellen Morrison became the hero her community had been waiting for, not despite her age, but because of it. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who've lived long enough to understand what's really worth fighting for. What moment in your life made you realize your experience was your superpower? Have you ever felt called to stand up for someone when others stayed silent? Share your story in the comments below. Your wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.